Hello, everyone. Welcome back. What's that? Fuzz. Hello, everyone. Welcome back. I'm Kris. This is American Revolutionary War Details History Class Never Told You. I don't think I've... no, I probably have covered a video or two from Grunge. Before we get started, if you can click that thumbs up, helps me out, bare minimum. Subscribe to the channel if you like the content. Click on the thanks button if you want to keep the channel rolling. All right, let's see what war details were left out.
There were plenty of messed up things about the American Revolution, which was far more complicated than just red coats versus blue. Here are just a few facts that didn't make it to your history classroom.
Taxation without representation.
Yeah, well, actually, that part was wrong. The Tea Act of 1773 that kicked off the infamous Tea Party was technically a tax cut, not a tax hike. Look, it's complicated. The tax cut wasn't designed to help regular Joe the tea drinker. It was actually to protect the bottom line of the British East India Company, which may have been the most powerful corporation in history.
Normally, British tea merchants sold tea to American traders in London at a markup, who would then sell the tea to colonists.
The British eventually realized that they could just sell their own tea to Americans, cutting out the middleman. And by cutting taxes on company tea, the British government made it possible for them to undercut the prices offered by merchants and smugglers who'd long brought untaxed tea into the colonies. Colonists saw this as a move to impose a monopoly that could leave them more dependent on Britain and undercut.
But we were forced to buy tea from England. We weren't allowed all the other options. So it might have been a cut, but it was still forced to pay, and that tax on the tea went to the British. Also, I'm listening to Shots Heard Around the World by John Furling, and they talk about Russia and the Habsburgs had stepped in to try to negotiate a peace, because by then it was the French and the Spanish with America going against the British. And the Habsburgs had tried to broker a peace deal, which would then give them, it would carve up the colonies and would give them a section of some of the states. England would have been allowed to keep the Carolinas and Georgia. French would have been given their section of land that they had prior to the French and Indian War. So it was basically Appalachian to the Mississippi. Spain kept Florida, and the colonists were given, I don't remember what the Habsburgs wanted. Anyways, we were given what was left of for this peace agreement. And France almost went along with it, but they didn't think that the colonists would. And so, yeah, they ended up backing out of it. And also, they backed out of it also because Spain didn't care about Florida. Spain wanted, was it Gibraltar? They wanted Gibraltar back. Was it Spain that wanted Gibraltar? Or did Spain want the Bahamas? I don't remember now. Anyways, it was really interesting. They Russia, by the way, wanted nothing. But in order for the negotiations to start, everyone had to stop funneling stuff to the Patriots and had to sit down and basically cease operations around the globe. And everyone was like, no, we're not doing that because we can't trust the other side to cease operations. It was really interesting. I got about 2 hours left of the book. It's really interesting.
Cut the protests against a lack of representation without taxation. That catchphrase was a bit too awesome to go so gently into the night. And no, undercutting the black market by driving prices down just doesn't have the same ring to it. Organized protests in several colonies forced merchants to drive East India Company ships back to the mother country with all their tea still aboard. And Massachusetts colonists, including Samuel Adams, were hoping to do the same. But the colonial governor Thomas Hutchinson wouldn't permit the ships to leave, and Adams told an assembly that there was no hope of changing his mind. Soon after, the Tea Party broke out, with thousands of onlookers watching as their fellow Bostonians tossed the precious tea into the harbor. The musical Hamilton has done a lot to restore the Marquis de Lafayette's place in American history, but the French weren't the only foreign powers to support the colonies against Britain. Spain, France, and the Dutch Republic were all keen on checking the expansion of British power, and they all offered aid of one sort or another to the rebels. Spain sent arms early in the conflict and later entered a formal agreement with France to support the revolution. And Dutch merchants, albeit without official government permission, ran supplies and arms to the colonists. As the revolution dragged on, Britain was increasingly tempted to focus on new conquests rather than try and hold on to 13 colonies. A series of peace agreements around the globe saw America, Britain, Spain, and France all come away with something they wanted. But unfortunately for the Dutch, they ended up worse off after the conflict. The Founding Fathers knew their revolution was part of a broader international war, but over the course of the 19th century, American history books began forgetting the key roles played by their foreign allies. The British and French held more territory in North America than just the original 13 colonies, including some of what's now Canada. So why didn't the Canadian colonies join the US in the fight for freedom?
It's never going to happen.
Not wrong, mostly, but it wasn't for lack of trying on the rebels' part. The American colonists tried to convince them. And when that didn't work, the Continental Army made a lackluster and ultimately embarrassing attempt to invade Quebec, bringing with them a note from George Washington telling them to protect the Québécois. But in the great French tradition of non merci, we're good, they were semi-politely rebuffed. But the American colonists were nothing if not scrappy and perhaps a little entitled. So 2 years later, the Continental Congress ruled that Canada could join them as a state whenever it wanted without needing a 9-vote majority by the other states. The Canadians were, and remain, absolutely not interested. Well, except for Alberta, but that's for another video. Look, wars cost money, lots of it. Unsurprisingly and inconveniently, trade, particularly with Britain, collapsed immediately after the war. But the fresh new Articles of Confederation neglected to give Congress authority to collect taxes, and creditors wanted payback. So in a good effort to make good on their Revolutionary War bill, the new government borrowed from their French and Dutch allies. And when that wasn't enough, they simply printed more cash. But the more money they printed, the less it was worth.
There was no currency at the end of the war. It had lost all its value.
We borrowed directly from France. We got, is it species? They started giving it directly to, it was like 6 million in that book. They gave like 6 million specie directly to the, I think it was like Washington. And it was for the American soldiers to be paid and then to buy whatever it was they needed. They didn't want to give it to Congress because I think they kind of believed that Congress just wasn't doing their job in supporting the troops in being able to supply them. I don't know if they thought maybe it was being stolen, but yeah, they gave directly to the troops near the end of the war. And it sounded like after the peace treaties kind of fell through and the Habsburg realized that they weren't going to get anything, and Canada was going to go to England. That was another thing. After that whole treaty fell through, it became France was going broke. They were 50 million livre in the hole on top of the 150 million that they were giving to the Americans. They didn't have the money. England was losing money. Spain was not hurting as much, but Spain didn't want to be the one left if France pulled out. And it kind of came to 1781, sounded like it was going to be the final year for the war. And I think both sides were looking at, we just need that one victory. And the thought was, after 1781, they didn't know if Spain would be able to stick in the fight. Spain had kind of said, you know, this is about it for us. just because they didn't want to be stuck with the bill if the French fell out. The French were going to be falling out. England was willing to stay in and fight, but the people weren't really interested in that.
All these factors combined to send the United States into a severe economic depression in the 1780s. It was so dire that it's been compared to the Great Depression, as in the Great Depression. It was bad. But rather than cooperate in the face of economic hardship, the states competed with each other for economic advantage. Add to all this the fact that many soldiers who'd fought for the Republic were left with unpaid wages, and you've got a very disgruntled population. Things came to a head in 1786 with an armed uprising led by former Captain Daniel Shays, as in they named a rebellion after him. The too long did not read version is a bunch of farmers in Massachusetts got tired of being taxed up to their eyebrows, so they did the sensible thing and tried to overthrow the government. While short-lived, Shays' rebellion inspired the creation of the U.S. Constitution by making it impossible for the young government to ignore its inability under the Articles of Confederation to handle the economic crisis. John Adams insisted that the day of celebration of American independence should be July 2nd, not the 4th. After all, the 2nd was the day the Continental Congress formally voted to adopt a resolution of independence. But the Declaration of Independence was only approved 2 days later, and it was the adoption of that document that cemented the commitment to liberty in the minds of many Americans, Adams' fellow founders included, and so the 4th of July became fixed as Independence Day by the early 19th century. But to get technical about it, many Americans assume that the Declaration was signed on July 4th, 1776. Not so. The version of the Declaration that went to the printers that July had only one name at the bottom: John Hancock, President of the Continental Congress. Other members of the Congress only began to sign later that August. And by that time, the makeup of the Congress had changed. Not everyone who signed the Declaration as part of their state delegation had been present for the original debate. Even if the signing had happened on the 4th, several delegates were absent and New York abstained from voting. History has its eyes on you, New York. It wasn't until January 1777 that a copy of the Declaration was published with the full list of signatures. Fun fact, Jonathan Dayton was the youngest signer. He was only 26 years old when he put pen to paper. Dayton, Ohio is named for him. Wasn't that fun? The larger war between European powers factored heavily in the decisions of Spain, France, and the Dutch Republic to support the American Revolution. But just as the Revolution was one part of a larger war, it also represents a link in a chain of revolutions that swept across the world at the end of the 18th century and continued well into the 19th. In fact, the American Revolution impacted the French Revolution to a remarkable degree, including increasing France's debts under Louis XVI. Another ally, Spain, lost its American empire in a wave of wars of independence fought in Mexico, Chile, Argentina, and beyond. American influence was also evident in the successful Haitian Revolution that
by the way, since we're talking about things they don't teach in history class, I am related to King Louis XVI. So there you go.
ended in 1804, and the unsuccessful Irish Rebellion of 1798. Brazil broke away from Portugal, and Greece, the homeland of so many ideas that inspired the Founding Fathers, won its independence from the Ottoman Empire after the American Revolution. Even back then, America was trendy. The divide between pro-independence colonists and those who wanted to stick with the British Empire is covered in most school curriculums on the American Revolution. But it was more complicated than it sounds. While democratic practice wasn't new to the colonies or to the British by the time of the American Revolution, it was far from a given that the United States could sustain a republic, or that everyone who even fought for independence wanted one. So there were three sides: those that wanted to stay with Britain, those who wanted what we have today, and that third faction that wanted a new king of their own. A number of Continental Army soldiers wanted to establish a constitutional monarchy with an American-born monarch. One even wrote to George Washington in 1782 encouraging the general to crown himself king.
The poet Robert Frost once remarked that George Washington was one of the few men in all of human history who was not carried away by power.
Thank goodness for that. Even after Washington firmly refused, the dream of an American monarchy didn't die. Tempted by an oxymoron known as
Washington never had any interest in there because one of his early role models was Cincinnatus. Cincinnati's named after him, which I've told this before. Cincinnati was a Roman Caesar in the year and long time ago, 2,000 plus years before Washington, and was given the power of the Caesar, went off and, there's three of them, went off and fought, vanquished Rome's enemies, came back, gave up power, 7 or 8 years, and he had it for a decade. He gave it up at 7 or 8 years, went back to being a farmer. I think he was in his 30s at the time. France called on him 30 years later, late 60s. Came out, got the title again, went off, fought, came back. I think it was like 3 or 4 years. This one wasn't as bad. Came back, handed over power back to the thing, went back to being a farmer. Kind of sound familiar? Washington, general of the military, gives up his commission, comes back, becomes a president. Although, granted, that was 83 to 89. He gave up that power. Came back, 2-term president, and then handed power back. So it left a mark on him.
Enlightened despotism, a group led by Continental Congress President Nathan Gorham approached Prince Henry of Prussia about the king job. Henry declined, just as Washington had, wisely intuiting that a people who just fought for independence from one king wouldn't be keen on another, although he did slyly suggest they ask the French instead. The Constitutional Convention never considered the concept of an American monarchy, at least not in those words, but Alexander Hamilton did float the idea of presidents that served for life, which is kind of the same thing when you think about it. If the nuances of the British and colonial positions in the American Revolution are often sanded away in the history books, the feelings of Native American groups are usually left out altogether.
Forget all that, kid!
The closest many lesson plans come to touching on Native involvement is explaining how the French and Indian War impacted the American Revolution. But natives were an active force in the conflict on both sides. Before the Revolution, the British government tried to keep the natives and colonists separated to prevent fighting. The large tracts of land reserved for the natives in the West were a sore spot for many Americans, so when the Revolution broke out, it was widely assumed that the natives would side with the Redcoats. But most tribes were neutral, at least at first. A few natives joined the rebels at Boston in 1775, but it took a while for most native nations to choose sides. While the British could point to their land policies to entice allies, and many natives saw an America without those treaties as the greater threat, the decision of who to fight for wasn't an easy one, and it caused several fractures within native communities. The Iroquois League split over the issue, as did the Cherokee Nation. Natives acted as scouts, foragers, and fighters on both sides. But whichever side they chose, the natives lost heavily in the aftermath when the British surrendered all of the Western territory they'd once kept the colonists from settling at the natives' expense. School books, popular history accounts, and Schoolhouse Rock all insist the American Revolution ended with the Battle of Yorktown. And yes, sort of. Yorktown did lead to the war's end. After the battle, the British...
Yorktown was the final battle on American soil, but that was in October 1781. The peace treaty wasn't signed until 1783, so it was kind of the end of hostilities here, but the war carried on around the globe.
British forces were decimated, but the surrender of General Charles Cornwallis to George Washington wasn't the deciding factor in American independence. Cornwallis surrendered in October 1781, but serious peace negotiations between the two sides didn't begin until April 1782, and it took well over a year to draw up and sign the Treaty of Paris. Meanwhile, fighting continued on the seas and deep into the frontier of British-American territory. French and British ships traded fire, French forces attacked British Canada, and skirmishes between Native Americans, American loyalists, and colonial soldiers raged throughout the West.
Loyalists in the Carolinas and in Georgia wouldn't lay their arms down.
There were battles further west than Georgia, too. The furthest west battle was at Fort San Carlos. That's in modern-day St. Louis, as in the Missouri one. 1782 would later be dubbed the Bloody Year due to the intensity of the fighting that went on in unsettled territories. So the fighting went longer and further west than you ever imagined. The white leaders of the American Revolution were well aware of the...
Yeah, I didn't realize that they went... I know that was the last of the colonies fighting. Didn't realize it went beyond.
Contradiction slavery presented for a movement based on the ideals of liberty and equality.
Of course, now that I say that, it wouldn't be shocking because George Rogers Clark went to Kaskaskia, Illinois, which is basically on the western side of the Mississippi at the start of the Revolutionary War, and he doesn't get credited for taking Fort Kaskaskia. Fort Sackville, he does. There's a monument there. Fort Sackville's gone. Now it's a George Rogers Clark monument. So, yeah, Okay. Yeah, that makes sense.
Yes, you lay the evils of slavery at the feet of the king, but you say nothing of slavery itself, sir.
His hypocrisy didn't escape British notice either. A royal proclamation was issued promising freedom to any black American who fled their masters and fought with the Redcoats, and attracted some 100,000 people. But as early as the Battle of Lexington, there were black combatants on the side of the colonists. At first, some black Americans held out hope that the Founding Fathers' vision of America would mean their freedom. Even when that proved otherwise, between 5,000 and 8,000 African Americans participated in the revolution in some capacity. Not all of the white revolutionaries were thrilled by this, however. There was a real fear of arming slaves, even for the sake of independence, and the racism prevalent at the time left many in the Continental Army doubtful of the abilities of black soldiers. But as the war went on and colonial manpower was in short supply, they had no choice but to accept black men into the Army and Navy, and many served with distinction and won their freedom by the war's end.
Interesting. That was good. I enjoyed that. So anyways, here's that Shots Heard Round the World. That's the book I was referencing. Let me see something. Hold on just a second. Let me see something. So 318. Give me a second. Let me try to find something. Give me a second. I want to try to find something. Okay. So I just wanted to read you something. This is page 314. It's down here at this bottom little chapter. I'm just going to read this to you. Austria, which joined the League of Armed Neutrality early in 1781, also offered to serve with Russia as a mediator. The Habsburgs wished to be part of an endeavor that would have international implications. Austrian leadership additionally sought peace in order to further the nation's economic interest. The war had dislocated maritime trade in Tuscany, but more importantly in Austrian Netherlands, now Belgium. During the war, numerous Austrian merchants had become deeply involved in exporting arms and other goods through Ostend on the North Sea to the markets in the Caribbean. Austrian leadership envisioned the belligerents negotiating. I gotta hold this better. Negotiating mediation terms at an international conclave in Vienna, with which would be held while the belligerents observed a 1-year armistice. One of the things that was turned down is John Adams knew that the Americans cannot go for 1 year not fighting and then have to restart everything. It's not going to happen on the American side. We either end the war completely or we continue to fight. Here we go. Observed a 1-year armistice. The Austrian solution for the question of American independence, the thorniest issue of all, given the intransigence. That doesn't seem right. Why can I not say that word? Intransigence? No. I don't know. Of France and Britain was the partition of America. France would regain Canada. Britain would retrieve the Carolinas and Georgia, which I had said. Sovereign American Republic would lie east of the mountains and stretch from New England through Virginia. Spain welcomed Russia's offer, but stressed its desire to first regain Gibraltar and Florida and to secure its Central American interest. And then jump forward. Adams sailed from he had gone to the Netherlands in mid-17 to seek a loan. Austro-Russia proposal for an armistice in the American War, during which Britain and the American colonies would negotiate the reestablishment of peace. Vergennes did not reveal that the Austrian Chancellor favored the partition of America, a step that would diminish the size of the independent United States and leave it encircled by major European powers. Adams read the proposal they had been given and wrote to Congress the same day that he would neither consent to mediation without a prior recognition of American independence nor agree to an armistice under any circumstance. Given America's war weariness, Adams knew that it was unlikely his country could ever resume fighting following a pause in hostilities. So I just wanted to read that part about it being partitioned up. Very interesting. Okay, well, we're going to end this here. If you didn't care about that, I apologize. But until next time, have a good day, have a good night.